feeling? We're ready? All right, I'm gonna, Melissa, let's see. I'm gonna say here, and she'll fix it. Okay. Hello. I'm gonna do it. I'm interrupting you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Dan Rosenberg, the director of the Visiting Writers series, and thanks for coming out to tonight's event. I will begin, as always, by thanking NYSCA, the New York State Council for the Arts, whose funding supports this and all of the other public-facing arts programming that comes out of the Wells Visiting Artists program, of which the Visiting Writers series is one. And tonight's event features the wonderful nonfiction writer Melissa Faliveno. I'm going to introduce Melissa, then she'll come up and read for a bit. We'll do a Q&A at the end, and then we can polish off those cookies so you don't send them home with me, please. So, to introduce Melissa, this semester, one of my classes is studying the Odyssey, and we've been talking a lot about the genre of nostos stories. Those are stories of homecoming. Apparently, this was a significant genre in ancient Greece, with many stories of the different heroes of the Trojan War coming home, but the Odyssey is the main one that has survived. My students have been thinking deeply about nostos, which is the root for nostalgia, the pain of longing for home, the pain of wanting to return to the place that shaped you. Of course, now we use nostalgia to mean something like an affectionate recollection of some pleasant period in the past. The spatial has given way to the temporal. Home becomes not a place, but a time. Or is it both? My students are still grappling, as I am, with the question of what Odysseus is trying to return to, and if he found it when he finally made his way back to Ithaca. This is a weird introduction to Melissa Faliveno. But I keep thinking about these concerns while reading her book, Tomboyland, because the whole collection roils with the desire to locate herself, to find a home and a community, to locate herself in a body, in a set of identities, in relationships. Or maybe it's the desire for such a home that is really the desire to long for it, to have a locus for nostalgia. Sometimes I want to go home, she says. I'm just not sure what that is anymore. That's from her second essay, which ends with a nod to the romantic poet John Keats's definition of negative capability, which he says great artists have. It's the ability to be in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact or reason. It's a tall order to stay uncertain, to not just traverse, but remain in the liminal spaces. But that's why Faliveno claims queer as the least uncomfortable of a set of labels that never completely fit. That's why she says that most days she believes that America should just get rid of all of its guns, but some days she thinks of the Midwesterners she loves, who belong to the group that her fellow coastal liberals think of as uneducated, gun-toting rednecks, and she can't quite embrace that answer to the crisis of our endless mass shootings. It's a question like so many I'm still trying to figure out, she says. I believe her, but I also don't believe that the point of trying is to come to a solution, that there is some fact or reason that she's pursuing. It's the exploration of the uncertainty that animates this book and this writer. And when she wonders if there's a non-toxic form of masculinity, I think about raising my son and conversations I've had with my wife and with my students about this very question. And when she locates in herself a masculinity that's tied to rage and violence, I think about how differently I'd be reading these passages if she were a man, and how that difference is at least part of what she's exploring in the book. Which is all to say, this is an intimate collection of essays, in that it invites us into Melissa Faliveno's life and questions, and it seems to welcome our own questions along those lines. To insist that uncertainty is itself worthwhile, that we can be confused together briefly, that brief togetherness can be a kind of home. Melissa Faliveno is the author of the essay collection Tomboyland, named a Best Book of 2020 by NPR, the New York Public Library, Oprah Magazine, and Electric Literature. and recipient of the 2021 Award for Outstanding Literary Achievement from the Wisconsin Library Association. Her work has appeared in Esquire, Paris Review, Bitch, Literary Hub, Brooklyn Rail, and The Millions, among others. The former senior editor of Poets and Writers magazine, she's an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and on the MFA faculty at Vermont College of Fine Arts. Please join me in welcoming Melissa Faliveno.
So someone over there was like, I'm going to cry tonight. And that intro, my God, almost made me cry. Thank you, Dan. Seriously. It was beautiful. Can you hear me? Is this thing on? Okay. Thank you all for being here on it's Friday? Is it Friday? Yeah. It's been a weird, long, whirlwind few days. So thank you for joining me and spending your Friday with me. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dan, for inviting me to be here. And thank you to all who came out for our little workshop previous, which was all about memory and kind of working our way into the spaces of uncertainty, which, as Dan so eloquently said, is all over this book. That is exactly what this book is about, is sort of learning to be okay in uncertainty and in the liminal space of unknowing. Whether it's gender identity or place or politics or whatever it may be. And that is a space that I'm constantly trying to interrogate and enter and sort of live in. I just kind of live there. And that's what my essays do. What you said about Nostos. It's just like, I'm still thinking about it. And that was like the guiding principle when I was writing what is the last essay in this collection. But I'm not going to read from that because I actually would cry if I read it after that. So I'm not. I can't cry in public. I am Midwesterner, you know. I just can't, I can't do that. What I am going to read from, and maybe if I'm feeling okay at the end of this one, I'll read a little snippet of that. I'm actually going to read from the first essay in this collection, and I think it's still kind of in line with what Dan was talking about. I think of this essay very much as kind of like my origin story. It's where I came from. It's the place I came from. It's about a very early obsession that I had as a kid and that I still think about a lot. And, it kind of introduces you to the place where I came from that is, that exists throughout these essays and throughout the book. And it's very much about this process of trying to interrogate the stories that we tell about ourselves, about our lives, about our families, the stories that our families tell, how along the line of memory and time stories change. It's like this constant game of telephone. You never really know what's true, what becomes sort of mythological in your own memory, your own sense of self, or your family's sense of identity. So that's very much what this essay is about. It's a really long essay, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. That would take me like 4 days. So I'm going to read a few sections actually. And my essays are very long and rangy, and so they're often about a lot of different things. I like associative thinking. I jump from idea to idea, and I try to figure out what those connections are all about in my brain. Sometimes I don't. I usually don't actually find an answer. I just like the connective tissue. But it's about this tornado that destroyed a town. But it's also about faith, and it's about obsession, and it's about mythology. And it's very much about the place where I came from. And for those of you who are in the class that just happened, try to pay attention to the ways that the speculative works its way in, how I use it. Okay. This is called The Finger of God. Any Twister fans in the audience? You know the movie? You don't? Oh. Y'all into the 90s? I know it's back. Well, you'll be into it after this, if I do my job tonight. The finger of God. There's an epigraph. The epigraph goes, "You have not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm." And that's Hebrews 12:18. It was a warm night in early June, the Midwestern kind of warm, specific to spring, so humid it's hard to breathe, when a tornado struck and destroyed a small Wisconsin town 8 miles west of my own. I was just over a year old. My mother, who was not yet 30, younger than I am now, and still figuring out how to parent her only child, came into my bedroom as I slept. She stood at the window, looking out into the darkness of the west. It was the same window through which I would look for years to come, whenever the clouds began to build, my face and fingers pressed to glass, cranking it open to get a better look at the sky. But that night, it was my mother who watched. It was sometime after midnight. Maybe the wind was howling. Maybe there was thunder. Maybe, more likely, there was only silence. That still, strange, calm Midwesterners know so well, the kind that heralds the most violent of storms. And then my mother saw them. Fast, bright sparks of green, a second or two apart, like flashbulbs in the distance against the dark. It took her a few seconds to realize what she was seeing. A massive tornado, invisible in the black of night, striking each pole of the power lines that ran along the highway, a road that connected a small doomed town and our own. Soon, she would pick me up, press my body to her chest, and hurry us down to the room beneath the stairs, where we would huddle together and wait out the storm. But for a second or two, she just stood in the dark, looking out into the night, struck still with fear and maybe wonder, unsure if she was awake or dreaming, as a great unstoppable force tore through a sleeping town, destroying everything in its path. It was June 8th, 1984. The town was called Barneveld, and the tornado, the largest in Wisconsin history, was an F5. On the Fujita scale, since renamed the enhanced Fujita scale, which rates the intensity of a tornado from 0 to 5 based on wind speeds and the severity of damage, from minor to total destruction, the F5 is the largest, rarest, and most powerful tornado. It carries winds of up to 300 miles per hour and can stretch a mile in width. It has the power to rip entire houses off their foundations, crush steel-reinforced concrete like it's tin. It can pluck trees and livestock from the land and toss them into the sky, throw cars, trucks, tractors, and trains a mile away. The F5 is dangerous, unpredictable, and unforgiving, a force of nature so destructive, so incomprehensibly powerful that even the most scientifically minded among us can't help but think it biblical. In the 90s action movie, Twister, a group of storm chasers led by Helen Hunt and the late Bill Paxton pause around a dinner table on the Oklahoma stretch of Tornado Alley when someone asks what an F5 is like. Commotion at the table ceases. Conversation comes to a halt. Forks are placed gravely onto plates. One of the elder chasers on the team, a character nicknamed Preacher, stops in his tracks as he serves up a round of coffees. Stock still and serious, he says, "It's the finger of God." I grew up in a small God-fearing town in southern Wisconsin called Mount Horeb, a blue-collar place dealing in livestock feed and John Deere tractors. It was a farm town on its way to becoming a suburb, with a population back then of around 3,000. Mount Horeb is perched on a hill, surrounded on all sides by long rolling fields of corn and wheat and soy. About 8 miles to the west is Barneveld, a sister town. The two communities share feed mills, farmland, and a lumber co-op, congregations, families, and a high school football team. Between the two towns are the Blue Mounds, a stretch of low, tree-dotted mountains, a geological anomaly in that part of the state, in a region known as the Driftless area. It houses a network of caves beneath them. As kids, we were told that the mountains protected our little town like a castle's defensive wall, from storms, from spirits, from whatever dangers might come our way. We were told that there was something about the Blue Mounds, some inexplicable property of physics maybe, something magical or even godlike, that kept Mount Horeb safe from tornadoes. If a tornado was moving in from the west, they said, the mounds would stop it. The mounds would protect us. Mount Horeb takes its name from the Torah, specifically from the book of Deuteronomy, as the mountain upon which God relayed the 10 Commandments to Moses. Though in the Christian Old Testament, the mountain in question is Sinai, the pastor of our small Lutheran church returned to these biblical origins sometimes, reminding us during his sermons that the name of our little town meant the mountain of God. I'm skipping a long section here on youth groups. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I encourage you to read the rest of it. I was 9 or 10 when the obsession began. This was the dawn of a strange and inexplicable few years in my small girl life when I couldn't be interested in anything without being consumed by it. I was obsessed with the weather, like I was obsessed with pogs and pewter dragons fused to amethyst, with the Beatles and the Kids in the Hall and Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats soundtrack. I tore through books about tornadoes, first at the public library and then at the Walden Books in the mall 30 minutes away in Madison, where my mother and I drove on the weekends. It's the only bookstore in town, I promise. We spent hours in that tiny chain bookstore where I snaked from the horror section to the nonfiction aisle, sitting on the floor with a stack of Christopher Pike and R.L. Stine and whatever slick new odes to destruction I could find. I studied tornadoes. I learned how to prepare. I read about meteorology, weather patterns, the clashing of warm front and cold. I read about the jet stream, pressure systems, dew points, and supercells, about cumulus, cumulonimbus, and funnel clouds, about rotation, radars, and lead time, the number of minutes, or more often seconds, between warning and touchdown. I read about the static currents survivors said they could feel in their skin, about the green of the sky, the electric smell in the air, like a lightning-struck power line or a live wire. I read under the covers in bed with a flashlight. I read the words of scientists and storm chasers and meteorologists who spoke like prophets of the warming of the earth, who warned of the coming years and the severity of storms that would only get worse. A few years later, when my friends and I were buying Teen Beat and Bop from the grocery store and hanging centerfolds of Leonardo DiCaprio and Jonathan Taylor Thomas on our walls, I developed a crush on the local television meteorologist. His name was David George, and he was a pale, middle-aged man with round cheeks, thin lips, and a Texas accent. I worshiped David and watched his forecasts religiously, sometimes in the spring and summer during peak tornado season, all 3 nightly newscasts at 5, 6, and 10. When I was 14, my parents procured a glossy autographed headshot of the NBC 15 chief meteorologist himself and gave it to me as a Christmas present. I taped it up next to Leo and JTT, and each night before bed, I admired their faces in the glow of my nightlight. These androgynous boys and one cherubic middle-aged man. I wished them all good night and said a little prayer to David for keeping me safe. If a tornado was the finger of God, then what did you call the man who predicted God's hand? David George was a prophet of severe weather. He offered not just protection, but a sense of control just when I was starting to become aware of my lack of it. Adolescence had become its own kind of storm system, volatile and unpredictable. My body's boyish build had begun to shift course, budding breasts and bleeding, and I began to realize that even the sturdiest structures, like family and home, could be blown away in an instant. I latched onto David as a strange kind of constant. Tornadoes were both childhood monster and wrath of God, and David told me when they would come. standing against his green screen, hands following the invisible path of the jet stream. He told me when we were under a watch or a warning. He stayed up with me on summer nights when the watches lasted well into the early morning. He kept me updated on each cell's location, which direction it was heading, and what towns were in its path. A soothsayer, preparing us for who and what we might grieve. He told me the speed of straight-line winds, the diameter of hail, if a funnel had been spotted, and where it might touch down. He sat with me, tie loosened, as long as the power stayed on and the station stayed on the air, even as the winds rippled waves across my 12-inch TV screen. He stayed by my side while my parents slept, the two of them convinced the sirens would save us. Twister was released in 1996 when I was 13. I'm really dating myself here. I saw the movie twice in theaters and owned a copy on VHS that I watched until the tape wore out, and the picture on our tube TV began to wobble and wave like it did in a storm. I was fascinated by the idea of Oklahoma and Kansas, this dark heart of Tornado Alley. I dreamed of being a storm chaser, me and a crack team of scientists who might develop the ability to see inside a tornado, so we might better understand the storms and build better warning systems, so we might protect sleeping towns like Barneveld. It wasn't enough to be saved. I wanted to be the savior. In its opening week, Twister brought in over $41 million, making it the #1 blockbuster in North America, second only that summer to Independence Day. It went on to earn over $500 million, was played constantly on the USA Network, and was quickly dubbed a new American classic. But Roger Ebert gave it just a startling 2.5 stars, calling it, quote, loud and, quote, dumb, and most other critics panned it, bemoaning the special effects, taking a front seat in the proverbial storm-chasing pickup truck to character development or plot. On Rotten Tomatoes, the movie boasts a lousy 57%. When asked, meteorologists and storm chasers will still roll their eyes and tell you that in terms of the movie's science, it's mostly bullshit. I loved it. More than 20 years later, I still love it. On a recent rewatch, which I do at least once a year, typically at the height of tornado season, true story, I discovered that even though I know the movie by heart, it still fills me with certain dread. I'm still terrified as Bill and Joe drive headlong into each storm, cows swooping by and oil tankers exploding in their path. It's a ridiculous movie. And of course, I know every time how it will end. Impossibly, with Bill and Joe strapped to a pipe in the middle of a pasture, swinging in the wind, in the dead center of an F5 and miraculously surviving. But during those 113 ridiculous minutes, I'm still gripped by the possibilities the movie entertains. I'm still held fast by both the fear and the thrill of it. I'm convinced that I, too, could survive an F5. When I was a kid, I was enamored with Paxton's Bill Harding, who I perceived to be the hero of the film. He was stoic, like all good Midwesterners. He was serious, straight-laced, and smart, with no time for the hijinks of his fellow storm chasers. Least of all, his estranged wife, Jo, played by an obsessed and somewhat unhinged Helen Hunt. Jo was smart, but she was also unstable. She was wild and willful and reckless. Where Bill was solid, Jo was erratic. She was volatile. She was crazy, says Bill's new fiancé, the craziest one of them all. She was a woman who ran directly into the storm, despite the desperate protestations of the men in her crew who banged her fists against the chest of a man who wanted to protect her from harm, from nature, from herself. She is woman as fable, as harbinger. We're meant to be in awe of her, to marvel at her tenacity, but we're also meant to fear her. We watch face and fists as she screams into the wind and storms away. We watch in the end with relief as she is held at last in the arms of the man who loves her, who keeps her safe from the storm. So, I mean, at least it's a good ringer. It wasn't until recently that I understood Jo had been the hero all along. With her unruly hair and dirt-stained clothes, her khakis that were almost certainly stuffed with pens and a small notebook and a compass and a knife and an assortment of tools I didn't even know about, her boyish mannerisms and short androgynous name, unlike Bill's new fiancée, a nice proper woman named, horribly, Melissa, Jo was everything I wanted to be. She was a woman who carried both an all-encompassing fear and the obsession born of it, both desire and the pain from which it was created, a burden and a torch that burned in her and carried her forward, which a girl like me might have noticed had she only looked closely enough, had she only possessed the tools to see. I'm going to read one more section. There's a murky line between story and myth. When I was a kid, my mother told me stories about tornadoes. She told me the story of the Barneveld tornado, the worst she'd ever known, and about the tornadoes of her youth. She told me these stories so often, I felt like I had been there, watching those fast sparks of green through my bedroom window, watching a twister dance across a cornfield, scrambling for storm cellars, hacking at latches and hauling open heavy wooden doors, running down muddy stairs and hiding underground until the storm had passed. She told me decades-old tales that her mother and grandmother had told before her, of towns and trees and trailer parks demolished and others left untouched. She told me of the skies turning green, and she told me of the sound, like a freight train, she said, its low groan in the distance growing louder and higher to a deafening tea kettle whistle. She told me of the tornado that hit her grandparents' farm just outside Monroe, and of picking through the wreckage afterward, finding a potted plant that had been lifted from the porch, carried a few hundred feet, then set back down in a nearby field, upright, undamaged, the soil and leaves intact. And she told me the story that had gone down in family lore for generations, that would carry on with each new generation, about a single blade of straw that had been lifted and tossed from a nearby barn and had somehow, impossibly, pierced the glass of a sliding patio door. I wondered about this story, about the physics of it, if such a thing was even possible. I wondered if the story had been misremembered or made up entirely. If it began as a story to spook children around a campfire in the summer, and eventually somewhere along the unreliable line of memory and time had become the truth. I wondered about other stories, too. If tornadoes actually sounded like freight trains, like everyone always said. If debris could be carried hundreds of miles away. If cars could end up on top of houses. Or if these stories, like the blade of straw, were just tall tales that had become the truth over time. Or perhaps they had become something even more true than the truth, the way stories often do. When tales of fear and fragility, of warning and awe, function to protect or prepare us for danger. I could have researched these stories, but I never did. I chose to let them live on, as my mother and my grandmother told them, as my family remembered them. I chose to believe them. Thank you. So now questions, and I'm open to everything, anything, nothing is off the table.
I thought you were talking about reading something that would make you cry.
Oh, God, you had to call me out, huh? Yeah. I mean,
We're not gonna.
I'm always happy. I could read more if you wanted me to read more, but I also love questions, and I love a Q&A. So whatever we want the most, I'm here for. What do the people want?
Are you excited for Twisters?
Great question. Great question.
Or is there something about the original that you're wary of?
It's like both, you know. I'm gonna see it, you know, because it exists in the world that I love so much. And I feel like I heard or read somewhere that Helen Hunt at least had like a hand in it, which makes me feel a little bit better. Or maybe I'll just choose to believe that so that I can go see it ethically. I'm expecting it to suck, and so as long as I go in with that, I think I'll be okay. I don't know. To me, it's a perfect movie, and I go back and I watch it, and I'm like, this is perfect. You don't need to do anything else, but I'll see it. Maybe I'll write a sequel. Yeah.
Do you have any more driftless folklore?
Oh.
Pretty wild area.
Yeah. Do you know it?
Yeah, we used to live in Wisconsin, Milwaukee.
Oh, amazing. Love
It's the
Milwaukee.
only place that had hills in
Yeah.
Wisconsin.
It's such a good city. I do. I mean, the last essay in this book is called Driftless,
Oh, yeah.
and it's all about the area. But yeah, I lived. I mentioned this in this essay, but do you know the Cave of the Mounds?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was like 5 miles away. The Cave of the Mounds. It's a cave. This cave system that you can go take tours, and my favorite part of it as a kid was. Nobody really knew. I mean, I'm sure someone knew, but the lore was like, nobody knows what happened. Was that there was a family of Smurf figurines that someone had placed in a crevice, and they just sort of lived in the corner of one of these caves, and the tour guides would be like, nobody knows where the Smurfs came from. And we'd be like, oh my God. You know, so it was like, there were like spirits that lived in the caves, and that was like the driftless lore for me. Yeah. But yeah, check out that essay. I love the driftless. Yeah. Yeah.
In that first essay that you read from,
Yeah.
I guess later on you described going back to Mount Horeb, and you adopt what I thought of as a sort of journalistic attitude to it, where you're interviewing people, you're just letting them tell their stories. And I was wondering, like, what was that like for you?
Yes. Great question. I'm so glad you asked. So this essay has a really interesting story. At least it's interesting to me. So I started it when I was in my MFA program, and I think it was based on a prompt to write about an obsession, something that you're obsessed with. I love this prompt. I teach it all the time now. Like, think about a thing you were obsessed with when you were a kid, and you have no idea why. And then, like, write into it, try to figure out what that obsession was about. So I started with the Barneveld tornado because this was this like mythological thing that had happened when I was 1 year old. So obviously I did not remember it. I had no recollection of it. But it was such a part of the fabric of the stories that were told about my town and this sister town. I had so many friends from Barneveld. I went to church with people from Barneveld, knew people who had lost, their houses, knew on some level that people had died, but I didn't know any of them. But I was obsessed with this idea, so I wrote into that, and then I remembered this like multi-year obsession with the weather and how I would just like sit and watch the weather every night, and then I remembered the photo of David George, and it just spiraled from there. And my essay process is really about the spiral, like let the spiral happen, go down the rabbit holes and like go as deep as possible. So I wrote this essay, and it was very much just my story of this storm that I didn't have any memory of, but it was about like this mythological story. And I published it, and it got placed in a literary magazine called Prairie Schooner, which is based in Nebraska. It's a very like Midwestern focused literary magazine. I was happy with it. I was stoked that it got published. It was like a quarter the length of what it is now. So I published it, and then when I sold this book, I realized that I wanted The Finger of God to be in the collection because it felt like this sort of origin story for me. And then I had this realization that was like, I can't actually tell this story in this way, in this sort of audience, for this sort of audience, without including the stories of the people who had actually been there. So, it's a long answer. In the year that I spent finishing the book after I sold it, I went back to Mount Horeb, my hometown. I went to Barneveld. I spent several days in the towns talking to people who had been through this storm. And I had no kind of like planned interview questions. I just sat down with people, and because they're such small communities, I just got put in touch with people who had like had their houses destroyed. And they, of course, were friends of friends. And one woman worked in the same hospital my dad worked in. My dad worked in the mailroom of a hospital, and she was like, she worked on some other floor, and they always intersected. And he was like, yeah, talk to Sue. So I met all these people, and I would sit down with them and just say, what do you remember? And they would tell their story. And what I found in that process was, you know, I was already really interested in this idea of storytelling and the mythological. And so I found these really interesting moments of intersection and divergence in story. You know, so I would say like, well, did it really sound like a train? Or unprompted, they would say, you know, and then I heard this sound and it was just like a freight train. I was like, oh, so it does sound like a train, you know. And then at one point they're like, yeah, I was standing outside the implements, you know, place that sells the farm equipment that got destroyed. And the guy was like, yeah, the sky just turned this like green color. I was like, all right, so the sky does turn green. And then, you know, and then it was like, yeah, but did the cow actually end up on top of the school? And they're like, no, the cow was not, there was no cow on the school, you know? So I got this sort of like corroboration, and then I got the divergences, and that then became part of the story, where I put that sort of experience of talking to the people on the page. And it does take on this more kind of like, that's very personal essay voice. It takes on a more reported tone, and the essay as it ended up is sort of what I see as, it's almost like a play, you know, it's a story in 3 acts. So I have that first act, which is very much my story. The second act is the story of the people who were actually there with that interview material in there, and then my own sort of like figuring out those intersections and divergences. And then the third act is sort of this like kind of bringing it all together, and also just ending with like, well, there's only so much I can know, and leaving it there. So it had a long life and an interesting revision story. Thank you for asking. Yeah.
In the master class, you had a lot of like really interesting writing exercises. So I'm kind of wondering, and you answered some of this already, but like wondering like what's like look into like your writing process or like your writing routine. Have one.
Great question. Yes, writing routine is so important if you're a writer, if you want to be a writer. For me, it is the most vital part, having a routine. If I don't do it, it's like I haven't eaten for the day. I haven't, you know, it's the same thing. Like I need to write, I need to feed myself, I need to exercise, I need to like step outside, you know. But I'm very much a creature of habit. I like ritual, I like routine. So ritual is actually an important part of the writing process for me. I write in the mornings when my mind is sharpest, and I have my little office space, and I always start the day by reading. So reading to me just like allows me to get in sort of a mode of thinking, and it's like a meditative experience for me. If I'm writing an essay, if what I'm working on that day is an essay, I'll typically read from an essay collection, you know, or an essay in a magazine or something. If I'm writing fiction, which I also write, I'll usually be reading a novel. And then I get to writing, and I light an incense stick, and usually my cat is curled up in a little slant of light. That's when I know I'm going to have a good day, if my cat joins me. And it's just, it's a space that I have turned on the writing part of me there, and nothing else is allowed in that room. When I'm in that space, I consider it sacred. Like I can't check my email, I turn off Wi-Fi, like I don't mess around with that. I certainly don't check emails until I'm done writing, because that'll just ruin everything. But yeah, it's very meditative. I have to like get in the space. I like to be able to see out a window, you know, see trees. Trees are kind of my happy place. If I ever get kind of stuck, I'll go outside and like walk in the woods and try to breathe and not look at a screen. And usually that helps me sort of get back into the state. But yeah, find your time, define your time, protect your time. Like that is it. The world will do everything in its power to take writing away from you. Do not let it. Seriously, that's it. That's like the thing. That's the thing. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I'd write through it. I would like go outside, you know, with my laptop and then I'm gonna survive this, you know? Maybe. Hopefully someday I'll find out. Maybe. Not. Yeah.
I mean, your parents gave you the glossy photo of, I can't remember his name now.
David George.
You remember his name. I knew you would remember it.
2 first names, 2 last names.
Besides that, like, how did they relate to, like, were they aware, I'm guessing, of your, obsession with
Yes.
him and that? And, yeah,
They
what did they make of it? How did they?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, they got me the photo, so they were clearly like encouraging it. I don't know. That's really funny because I don't really have a recollection of their involvement in any way. But I do know that like I watched the weather forecasts. Like I wouldn't watch the news, news hour. The news segment is a half an hour long, and I knew at like 5:16 the weather would come on. So at 5:16 I would go downstairs and like sit in the basement and watch the TV alone. And then at 6:16 I would go back and do the same thing in case anything had changed. Unless we were eating dinner, and then in which case I'd be like, all right, I guess I'll miss the 6 o'clock. But
Do you think did they know that you were doing that?
I think they must. They must have. I don't know. That's a really good question, and there's probably a lot of implication around like my parents' involvement in my imaginative life when I was a kid, which is to say, they were this is the late 80s, early 90s. They were like, go do your thing and then come home for dinner, So it wasn't. My youth was not like I don't remember a lot of my parents actually being a part of that creative, imaginative life. They were off doing their thing. But they had, they clearly knew about it. And then my dad thought it would be great to get that picture signed and give it to me, which, frankly, best gift ever. Yeah, it's like, the standby or the Christmas Story BB gun. It's like it's the Christmas gift that will outlast all other Christmas gifts. I still have it. Oh, also, after this came out, guess who found me on Twitter and wrote to me? David George. Yeah. He's now a weather forecaster. He's back in Texas. He's back in his homeland. I was really happy to see that. I was mortified. I was like, oh my God. So embarrassing. Way more embarrassing than my family finding out like the deepest, darkest secrets of my past. It was David George being like, and it was the sweetest letter. He was like, I'm so glad you were a fan.
Just right next to Jonathan Taylor Thomas.
If he wrote me, oh my God. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you.
I've been thinking about what you said about the spiral as
Yeah.
a method for writing essays, and
Yes.
I see how that is working for you in your story of like writing and revising these essays. I was just hoping you could talk more about how that works for you in your brain.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one of those things that like is very hard to kind of articulate because it happens in the moment, but so much of it happens in my research process, and I love research. To the detriment of my productivity sometimes, I have to really pull myself away from research. Like when I got into the Twister section, I was like, I'm going to read everything that has ever been written about Twister, and there's a lot out there. But what happens it's like the research process leads me down another rabbit hole, which leads me down another rabbit hole, which et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The more I read, the more interesting, weird thing I discover, or the more videos I watch, Research is not just reading. It's watching videos. It's rewatching the movie. It's listening to the music I listened to when I was that age, trying to like reimagine my life, remember what I was thinking or feeling, like watched an episode of Kids in the Hall. Like what a weird little kid that I was like little and I loved this like very adult sketch comedy troupe from Canada, you know, like things like that. So I make these connections and I follow that associative, the associative threads, and I write it all down. And sometimes I just have a messy list of all of the kind of tangential, peripheral ideas or threads or themes or whatever, and then I figure out which ones I really want to be in there, and ask like which of these are going to serve the story somehow. So like Twister, in that section when I read it, sometimes people are like, "Where's this coming from? Like, why are we on Twister?" The Twister becomes this sort of way into like the gender thread, and like that I was going through this period in my life where I was like, you know, my body was changing and I was, you know, experiencing some dysphoria, and like I didn't know that at the time, but like, you know, so that was a way in, but also because it's super fun to write about pop culture. I love writing about pop culture, and I will do it at any chance I get. So, yeah, go down the rabbit holes, follow the threads. Yeah.
Follow-up, I'm just wondering, like, in terms of your method or strategy of writing, like, I love what you said about the ritual of, like, making space to write.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, like, do you count some of that work as writing, or is that, like, a separate?
Like the researching?
Yeah, how do you divide that?
I totally count that as writing. It's part of the process. I count reading as writing. Sometimes I count walking around in the woods as writing. It's like I'm in it, you know. It's where I kind of have the thoughts and let the thoughts come and clear the decks a little bit to get into that space. So it's all related, and it's actually all a vital part of the process. So I'll have days that are just research days, you know, especially if I'm starting an essay or I'm really at the kind of beginning generative phase of an essay, especially. I'll get really deep in the throes of research, and that'll be my writing day, you know. And then I have to force myself to actually write, you know, which, yeah. So try to keep it balanced. Yeah.
You sort of just touched on this a little bit, but like in your class, we were talking about how our interpretation of events shifts, our memory shifts, our understanding and analysis of what is the truth shifts. I was thinking about just how large the hurricane was for you in your childhood. I'm sorry, the tornado. Sorry.
It's fine.
Coast,
Yep.
the tornado, and how it almost seemed like it's another character. It's a main character.
Yeah.
In your stories.
Yeah.
And how I'm imagining that shifted for you as you got older and you divined more of the metaphoric stuff in there.
Yes.
Do you want to touch at all on how, like, your relationship with the tornado? I want a Twister. Okay.
It's fine. I actually have like a little dig when I moved to New York. I was like, ugh, you people think hurricanes are bad. You have so much warning. Like, get out of your house. You know, like, which is like, tornado, you never know it's coming. It's so much more dangerous. Like, you know, like weighing the, you know, destruction of these two horrible natural forces. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's key to the revision process. Like, this story when I was younger was all about the tornado, and the tornado was this like monster, you know, this, you know, fire and brimstone kind of monster that it was larger than life, and it was like out of a horror story. I love horror. So I both like loved it and feared it, and was like, oh my God, this monster, what is this monster? Am I ever gonna see the monster? You know, every time there was like lightning, I would look out and be like, am I gonna see the monster? You know, hiding in the closet, you know. And as I got older, I think, you know, the implications of the storm really started to sink in, like, oh, you know, you lost your whole house. And then, oh, you lost your kid. Like, the implications are very, very deep that as a kid, I didn't understand that. I didn't get that. And so especially when I was, you know, writing this piece, I was in my 20s, and I was like, oh, it's about way more than me, you know? And I guess I knew that on some level, but I was really keeping the story my own. But then the story, the people involved in the story became more important to me than I think the storm itself. And there's a whole section in there about about the tornado, kind of like a minute-by-minute reportage that I do of how, what happened, as the power goes out, and what the town experiences. And that was pieced together through both, like I spent a day in the archives in Barneveld. They have a really awesome, like tiny public library, and their archives are essentially just the tornado. And everybody from town donates their archives to this library. So it's just like, Sue's box of photos and newspaper clippings, and Al's box of, and so then I went and talked to those people and rebuilt through reading the articles and the interview, and, rebuilt those stories. So they become kind of the fore of the story, I think. Yeah. Any more? Don't be shy. If anyone's got a last one, I'm here for it. Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Your generosity with the Q&A is lovely. Thank you. And I want to just quickly say thanks also to Justin, our one-man IT crew tonight, holding down the fort. Thank you. And I want to thank you all for coming. It's always really joyful to see the range of folks and people from, within and beyond our campus coming to take advantage of these events. To that end, I will just remind you of the embarrassment of riches that we have coming up in April. I'm not even gonna do the dates, because who cares? Here's who's coming, and you're gonna have to look it up to see when. Arts.wells.edu. We have a website that actually tells you all of the public-facing arts programming here. But coming up, in no particular order, we have our filmmaker in residence, Allison O'Daniel, will actually be in residence. She is the filmmaker who created The Tuba Thieves, which is one of the, oh shit is right. It fucking rules. It is such a good film. It is, I watched it alone, and then I was really angry because I watched it alone, because it's the sort of thing that you need to talk to people about immediately when you've watched it. And she will be here along with a panel of filmmakers and artists, and it's going to be a really lovely event. We're going to screen the film in Barler Auditorium, and then we're going to have a little panel discussion afterwards. That's going to be very cool. We also have, because my Odyssey students asked for it, Jay Leeming is a man who lives in Ithaca and who does public storytelling. He recites classic tales, and he's going to come to Wells and recite excerpt of the Odyssey for my Odysseys students and anyone else who would like to join us. That's also going to be in Barler. He'll be wearing his colorful scarf. He doesn't know that I've promised this, but I am committing him to it right now. And it should be an extraordinary thing. I was like, this is as close as we're going to get to experiencing the Odyssey how like ancient Greek people would have experienced it. Someone who knows it cold, reciting it from memory. It's going to be a wild thing. And then the third thing is our final visiting writer of this series is Kyra Simone. She's coming. She's a fiction writer and an editor, and she writes experimental, very short fiction and tricky, indescribable little texts that are going to be really fun, pushing the boundaries of fiction. And so that's all coming up in like the first half of April. I'm not sleeping until after that, and neither should you. What's that? No. If I'm suffering, you're suffering too. No, it's going to be great. I'm really excited for all of these things, so I hope you can come out and join us for them. Arts.wells.edu website. Look at us go. Thank you again, and please join me for one last round of applause for Melissa.
Dan, what about the eclipse?
Yeah, there's also an eclipse. You know, when the heavens turn dark, you'll know what's happening.
There's the open mic, and there's a bunch of things I get.
We have a full day of events. There's a very cool poster that will show you all of the crazy things that are happening. It includes a literary open mic, a book making thing. They're going to make a thing. I don't even understand what this is, but you're going to print a sun and a moon on paper, and they will overlap and become a corona. I don't know. It seems mysterious and magical, and we should all do that stuff too. On the day that is, when is the eclipse? The 8th. Okay. We're all over it. Cool. Yes. Thank you.